Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Daniel Flitton.
Thanks, Michael. It is a real pleasure. Just before Christmas last year, Kevin Rudd hosted an evening drinks on the lawns of Kirribilli House in Sydney, and as painful as it is for me as a loyal Victorian to say, it was a really wonderful setting. It's perched just by the harbour. We're looking out at the Opera House, the bridge and the city. And the gathering there was for about 100 or so of Kevin Rudd's closest friends from around the world. And we were there to discuss the Prime Minister's pet project, his idea to create an Asia-Pacific community and reshape the diplomatic architecture of the Asia-Pacific. There were foreign affairs officials, business leaders, academics, even the odd reporter. And we were there from 22 different countries, the US, China, Japan, Indonesia, right across Southeast Asia and beyond, Chile, Mexico, and we're all there to talk about the future of the Asia-Pacific. Ever the gracious host, Kevin Rudd stood up on a stool to give an impromptu speech about the importance of this gathering. And he spoke about the bonds that Australia has to the region, the opportunity to enhance ties between countries. And just as the PM was in full flight, something really strange happened. Down on the harbour waters, a group had hired a disco boat for the office Christmas party. And there it was, pulling up right alongside Kirribilli House, music blasting out across the water, and a fair bit of drunken singing and dancing going on as well, and incidentally, drowning out this important speech by the Australian Prime Minister. Had the summit been held in many of the countries that were represented there, I reckon it's likely that there would have been an exclusion zone set up with sharpshooters and naval boats on patrol, and that would have kept away these noisy miscreants. But thankfully, that wasn't the case in Australia, and Kevin Rudd, bravely enough, carried on speaking over the din. But the story is perhaps illustrative of Kevin Rudd's global hopes and fears. We have in Rudd a PM bursting with big ideas about Australia's place in the world. His hope to set up a new Asia-Pacific community, a bid for a seat at the United Nations Security Council, pushing for the group of 20 countries to respond to the global economic crisis and giving Australia a seat at that table, reigniting a drive to rid the world of nuclear weapons. But at the same time, there's an accompanying fear. For all of Kevin Rudd's talking, is anybody actually paying attention? Or does the background noise of world affairs simply drown out Australia's voice? One issue that I want to focus on today, I think we can dispense with fairly quickly. What would Kevin Rudd, former career diplomat, consider to be the greatest challenge for Australian foreign policy? Perhaps it's the rise of China. Maybe it's managing the fallout over the attacks on Indians in Melbourne, the war in Afghanistan. Perhaps it's preserving Australia's close ties with the United States, with Barack Obama soon to come to town. But no, these are all worthy issues, but there is one that looms even larger, and that challenge has a name: Tony Abbott. This is an election year, and for Rudd, ensuring that Labor wins government again is the most important element for Australia's national interest. He is, never forget, a politician. So this brings us to the more substantive issue that I wanted to talk about today. How has Rudd performed in foreign affairs, and how should he be judged in the forthcoming election? Now, it's often said that foreign affairs plays little role in the decision-making of the Australian voters, and I've written that too. But I should also admit that this view is more than just a little bit outdated. What is climate change if not an international issue? We can't separate the health of the economy from the rest of the world. Global affairs might be the backdrop to the retail politics of supermarket prices and tax reform, or the latest thought bubble from Barnaby Joyce, but it's a backdrop that puts everything else into context. And in an election year, foreign affairs is still important. So how has this government gone? In policy terms, taking bilateral relations in particular, Rudd has suffered. Let's run through a quick list. Relations with India, stuffed. China, edgy and hostile. Indonesia, tense. Japan, sour. Fiji, Suva kicked out our High Commissioner. It's not a great record, you'd have to say. But that's only if you stop there, as too many commentators and analysts have been prone to do in recent months, and judge foreign relations as if it's some kind of diving contest where we can hold up little scorecards at the end of each performance. Certainly, there have been particular difficulties in bilateral relations. Not all of them of this government's making, some issues that could have been handled far better. But it's important to judge the broader strategic context. It's been a tumultuous world in the short couple of years that Rudd has been in office. We've moved out of a dark episode where misplaced assumptions of unilateral authority did great damage to the conduct of international relations. We emerged in a time of hope, to use a term favoured by President Obama, for cooperation in face of the big problems such as the economic collapse to climate change. And now it appears that that multilateral moment might be over. And that leaves future trends far less certain. Australia has had some big wins. The seat at the G20 leaders meeting is the most significant achievement for Australia in the past couple of years, provided that the grouping finds an ongoing role. I'm not yet convinced that the G20 can outlast the crisis as the mechanism for coordinating action on the global economy, or that Australia has a natural place at that table. Yet I think Rudd deserves credit for both helping drive the meeting and for so far keeping us there. Nor is Rudd's Asia-Pacific community idea dead in the water, as was proclaimed early. I doubt that a new body will result, yet Kevin Rudd's proposal has achieved something really important. The idea has got countries talking about a way to rationalise the multitude of overlapping leaders' meetings across the region. APEC, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, not a leaders' meeting, but in essence to untangle the bowl of spaghetti that is our regional diplomatic architecture. And that conversation will be valuable. And Australia has also made what appears to be a very timely contribution to the debate on nuclear weapons, with the Evans-Kawaguchi report that was released last year, given especially that Rudd decided to set up this commission at a time which predated Barack Obama's Prague speech and his call for a nuclear security summit in Washington in April. Rudd was able to personally hand Obama a copy of this report in December last year and showcase Australia's contribution on what's still an incredibly important issue. Nor do I agree with the Coalition's claim that Australia's Security Council campaign is a waste or a diversion. The resources that are devoted to this bid are minuscule in comparison with other expenditure, particularly in the defence portfolio, and the returns, or the potential returns, are far greater in terms of Australia's engagement around the world, picking up on opportunities to advance Australia's political and business interests, and let's not forget also the chance to strengthen the UN. We should be in a race to beat Luxembourg. Otherwise, it's like we're handing over judgment on important international issues to the Geelong City Council. And Australia has too big a stake in those questions. But I do want to talk about what I see as a real weakness in the structural approach that this government brings to foreign policy. That weakness has a name: Kevin Rudd. This is not a criticism of the PM's grinning face beaming out from the cover of Time magazine as Australia's global guy, as happened last year, nor is it because Rudd submitted an essay to the prestigious US journal Foreign Affairs containing the type of prime ministerial gobbledygook that Australians have fast become familiar and fast become tired of hearing, warning For instance, that China and the US have a threat of incremental bifurcation, accepting the need to work with the extant political vocabulary within China's national discourse. And even, and I quote again, for some, even though for some this might seem a pointless theoretical discussion of political taxonomies. Surprisingly enough, the PM's essay was rejected. But my concern about Rudd is the personification of foreign policy in the form of the Prime Minister. You get very little reward from studying the worldview of Stephen Smith and attempting to understand how this might shape Australia's international attitude. Everything stems from Rudd. Now, that's not automatically a bad thing, but at the moment, the negatives are weighing. It's not really that Freudian slip. It's not really that Rudd has taken an interventionist attitude in foreign policy decision-making to the extent of deciding which nominated diplomats have sufficient language skills to serve abroad as an ambassador. Rudd last year scotched the choice of Hugh Borroman, a senior official in his own department, denying him a job in Germany and instead attempting to pack him off to Sweden. No, it's because Rudd has created a structure where he is seen not only as the last, but also the first word on foreign policy. Countries, naturally enough, want his direct attention, and they're not satisfied with anything less. It's too much for just one person. And because Rudd is who he is, a former diplomat, Mandarin-speaking specialist on China, once posted to Beijing, he is hostage to his own background and is finding it very difficult to escape this. China, for instance, expected much of Rudd and has wound up confused. The Defence White Paper last year included some strikingly open concerns about China's military ambition, coupled with an obvious reluctance in the government at the time to see China's state-owned companies buy into Australian resource firms. Beijing wondered what had happened to its new best friend. And at the same time, India watched on, convinced that a Sinophile Rudd had taken Australia into China's orbit. This was not helped by Rudd's decision to abandon uranium sales to India and has been torn asunder by the violence that's been directed at Indians in Australia and the media furor that this has generated. Japan, too, saw Rudd as a Chinaman and was suspicious of his plans. Seen in the big picture, some of these bilateral problems, however, can be overcome or understood. Don't forget, China might represent enormous economic opportunity, but the country remains under an authoritarian heel. And frankly, I'm less worried about an unhappy China than a kowtowing Australia. And while I don't agree with the decision not to sell uranium to India, the problem with the exploitation of the Indian students and then the violence that's been directed towards them has grown from seeds that were scattered well before Rudd came to office. Rebuilding trust will take a long time, and there was not a whole lot to start with in Australia-India relations. The most important measure, of course, is to stop the violence and to stop the attacks. And from there, I actually believe that the relationship with India can be much strengthened as a consequence. Rudd is learning. Perhaps more importantly, Smith is learning too, stepping out a little more. He's still cautious, still deep in the shadow of the PM, but Smith has delivered a couple of very strong speeches of late, first to help with the recovery of China relations last year, and just yesterday, finally, explicitly acknowledging the racial elements that are too evident in too many of the attacks on Indians. The signs are that Smith has been heard too. So I'll leave you with a final message, if I may borrow a few phrases from our dear Prime Minister. Frankly, if I may say so, speaking on behalf of the Australian Government, in response to that question on the Prime Minister's global hopes and fears and where he has taken Australia in the world, has he done enough? No. But with his favourite shoulder to the wheel, things are not all doom and gloom. Thanks.